and skipping over the ocean like a stone.
Hey, welcome to my book talk. Today I'm going to be talking about the story Whale Talk by Chris Crutcher. It is one of my favorite books of all time. I used to teach this book, but I have not read it in a few years. Some background about Chris Crutcher as an author: he actually went to school to become a psychologist. He got a psychology and sociology degree. He was a therapist for a really long time, and then at the age of 35 decided to start writing, and he has written books ever since. We look at this as the genre of This is America. I think one thing that isn't really talked about is the hierarchy of athletics in schools. So you normally have like the big ticket school sports like football, basketball, soccer, baseball, are also usually male dominated. Very rarely are female sports in the high school setting seen as important. But then you also have smaller sports that I think are looked down on, even within athletes themselves or athletic coaches. You have sports like the swim team, hockey, field hockey, lacrosse, golf, cross country, track. Sometimes those sports are seen as lesser or not important enough, and I think this book really goes into how important it means to belong, no matter what you belong to. A summary of Whale Talk by Chris Crutcher. It's a realistic fiction novel. There's no magic realism, there's no fantasy in it. It is something that could absolutely happen tomorrow. It could be something that happened 10 years ago. We see our main character. The story is told through TJ's perspective. TJ is a mixed kid growing up in a very white community. He has been adopted by two people who are very caring. So he's a teenager and he has to deal with really serious issues, the idea of loss and forgiveness. So as the story begins, we have this new athletic team that has been created at Cutter High School. And Cutter High School is all about sports, all about athletics, all about being the best. And so people who are athletes, they have Letterman jackets. And Letterman jackets symbolize so much more than just sports. They symbolize power, almost. You see this idea of these swimmers coming together with this goal of getting a Letterman jacket to kind of stick it to the man of all of the popular jock kids who hold this Letterman jacket as being the end-all thing of being in high school. You see this idea of perseverance, friendship, learning that it's going to be okay no matter what obstacles or struggles you're given in life. TJ becomes sort of their band leader throughout this, but then we also see issues at home that come up, not necessarily with TJ's family, but with other families and how they deal with that. So one thing I really love about this story is how adults are represented. TJ has two amazing parents that have adopted him. They've taken him in when he was a baby, and they are good people. His mother is a lawyer. His dad really helps out with child abuse cases. TJ has a really great relationship with his journalism and English teacher, Mr. Simmet, who ends up becoming the swim coach. He also has a really good relationship with his childhood therapist that he still goes and talks to throughout the novel. So I do want to read page 130 from Whale Talk. Sort of the philosophy behind the book and why it is titled Whale Talk is because of this lesson that TJ's dad actually teaches him. I don't even remember the point of the article, but it made a case for the possibility that whales' language is as sophisticated as ours, very intricate and precise. It also claimed that whale songs travel for hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles in the ocean. And I realized as I reached adulthood, without even knowing what it was to be human, nobody had ever told me how dangerous it is, how risky. I started wishing I were a whale. At least they'd know what it is to be a whale. I mean, think of it. I walk outside and scream at the top of my lungs, and it travels maybe 2 blocks. A whale unleashes his cry, and it travels hundreds or even thousands of miles. Every whale in the ocean will at one time or another run into that song. And I figure whales probably don't edit. If they think it, they say it. If some man whale cheats on his wife, her anguish, her rage, her despair is heard and understood by every whale who swims into the range of her voice. The joy of lovemaking, the crippling heartache of a lost child, it's all heard and understood. Predators and prey have equal voice. The Mother Teresa whales and the Jeffrey Dahmer whales all have their say. Whale talk is the truth. And in a very short period of time, if you are a whale, you know what it is exactly to be you. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson in this book. It all comes back to this idea that whales know exactly what it is to be whales. And so the idea of identity, who do you want to be, how do you want to act, and how is it going to come back to those around you who can hear your voice? As far as themes that we see throughout the book, there are so many that I could talk about. I do kind of want to narrow it down to 3. The idea of belonging, the idea of adversity, and the idea of racism. But racism is seen throughout the lens of TJ because he is one of the few mixed students at the school and in this entire town, actually. So he is targeted for things that are just stereotypes. There are racial slurs throughout this book. There's a lot of profanity. The entire story is told from TJ's narration, and he's a high school boy, so he is going to use that language. He hears the N-word constantly. All of the racial slurs, all of the profanity, it's kind of glossed over. Like, it's almost just so normalized that it's not something TJ fixates on. Instead, what he does is he doesn't use the racism towards him as a crutch. Instead, he allows his differences to be seen elsewhere. Like, he doesn't see himself as being black or mixed. He sees himself as a swimmer. And so that actually becomes his adversity. Being a swimmer becomes almost the prejudice, not his skin color. But the idea of belonging and having that identity, the story is told from TJ's perspective, and the idea that it's not about just him belonging, it's about the entire swim team. His idea to start the swim team really begins with the idea of equity and inclusion. He sees a kid being bullied. TJ also does with adversity, because all of the boys have something different that makes them an outsider, and then they somehow all come together to belong within this team. So really it is kind of like The Outsiders meets Breakfast Club meets a swim team trying to get through life at a school. A few pages that I'd like to read are specifically about their time on the swim team bus. Simon and Iko are doing what they do during these conversations, remaining invisible unless we invite them in. God, what must Coach be thinking? Here are these guys brought into his sphere of influence under the guise of a swim team that can't even swim. For some of them, he and Iko are the only decent adults they've ever known. There's nothing he can do about the past for any of them. And now the only thing he can do about the present is stand up for them against the rest of the athletic council, who want to rob them of their Letterman jackets. I'm proud of what we've accomplished. I felt tremendous relief today when Jackie Craig and Simon DeLong finished the 100-yard backstroke and personal bests, because it meant everyone had safely lettered, that we'd accomplished our goal, or at least my goal. I know the whole thing is only symbolic, a gesture, but it's a hell of a gesture, because let's stand up for ourselves in the language that is understood at this school. The very last bus ride that they have together, and he says, I don't know whether this helps, Simon says, but there's one thing they can never take from us, and that's this time. As a young man, I coached swimmers on their way to the Olympic trials. I coached championship teams at all levels, but I have never coached a team with the guts this team has. When I'm looking back on my coaching career, this is the team I'm proudest of. And he means it. We know it. We feel it. And it still feels like hell. For everyone here but me, and possibly Taroy, this is the way it always is. Do your best and get the crumbs. Jackie Craig starts talking, but then he says this, I don't know what I'm going to do when this is over. I never belonged to anything. I was never on a team, never chosen for, he stops, breathes again. When I got on this team, I couldn't believe it. I kept wondering when you guys were going to find me out and make me leave. What happens when this is over? God, what am I going to do? They've have this camaraderie now, and they have this sense of belonging, and even Jackie Craig feels like he doesn't know what he's going to do when they no longer have swim team to get together. And I think they've kind of just realized that they are going to stick together for the rest of school, or at least the school year. I love this book. I've always loved this book. I've always thought that this could be taken in two ways, as a very superficial story about a swim team, or something much, much more about belonging and a sense of camaraderie with people that you never really thought you'd fit with, because you never really thought you'd fit with anybody. For those outsiders, for those lone wolf kind of kids who don't really find themselves with an identity that others are like them. I think this really goes into an underdog story. I was a coach for swimming for 5 years. I really tried to bring what this book does to reality. I would never cut a student from the swim team. Instead, I would rather teach them how to swim. And even if they were terrible, you get better with practice, and you get better when you have a team that's cheering you on, even if you're the last one in the pool. And so TJ does this, Mr. Simon does this, they create something out of nothing. And I think that's the takeaway from this entire book, is that you can create camaraderie and belonging as long as you put yourself out there, as long as you show others that it's okay to not be the cookie cutter mold of an athlete. I do love the philosophy of Whale Talk, what Whale Talk means as far as, finding your truth in this world. TJ has to find that truth and that forgiveness, with other characters, and terrible things happen. The ending is very bittersweet, but we are still left with that idea of what that truth means, and what the idea of, Whale Talk is. Our voices echo into this eternity, and TJ learns this, and I think that's something that any student who reads this book can really learn and have as a takeaway.